Hi, boys and girls. So this is the end. We're going to read the last chapter together. And I did give you some things to think about. If you want to send me a couple of notes, you can do that. But I really just kind of want what happened in the book to sink in, okay? I wanted to first direct you back to a couple things in chapter 1. So before we begin reading, the very, very beginning, there's this. The very beginning of the book, it says The Search for Noah, and it's an excerpt from when Delphine and Tilly were looking for him, and they told Dr. Hutchings to take them to him. The other thing I wanted to point out was that, remember, the book starts in 1916, and then after this, we go back to 1861. So I want you to think about actually what's happening, like what's going on, what occurred, what was the book, essentially, okay? All right, and then I wanted to just point out a couple things. So the dad in 1916 is taking 3 boys on a trip up to Devil's Backbone to go visit his family. There's a few things I wanted to point out. It says, my dad made house calls in the Ford. That was the Model T way back. Remember the touring car? He was a very well thought of doctor in St. Louis of that time. So they live in Missouri. A tall man with black curly hair. Parted in the middle, and steel-rimmed spectacles or glasses gripping the bridge of his nose. He wore high celluloid collars, and I never saw him without a necktie. So he's a professional man. He's a doctor, okay? I thought he carried all the wisdom of the world in that black bag that he traveled to house calls with him on the front seat of the Ford. With the same silent skill that he used to set a bone, he could patch a tire. Apparently, my dad had been young once, but I couldn't picture it, even at the age of 15. So his son is 15. I knew but little about who he was and where he'd come from. And so I knew but little about myself. So this son of his, who's just about 15, wants to know a little bit more about his family background. So his dad's taking him back to his birthplace, the place where he grew up, the place where his family was established. So that is what occurred. We start off in the present time, we go backwards, and we come back to the present time. That's actually called an epic tale. That's what the word epic means. You know, we tend to use it as like big and ooh and gigantic and that's an epic skate park, dude, like for fantastic, wonderful. But truly, the literary sense of epic is what you are reading right here. So when we get into chapter 15, it's actually bringing you back up to present day, okay? So there were just a few things I wanted to go over with you. And if you look on page 6, it says, my dad was what they called a self-made man. Though he'd succeeded in St. Louis, he'd come from a little town called Grand Tower on the other side of the Mississippi River down low in Illinois. All I knew of Dad's people was that they'd lived through the Civil War. Imagine an age when there were still people around who'd seen U.S. Grant with their own eyes and men who'd voted for Lincoln, people you could reach out and touch. So he's going back to visit his dad's family, and they lived through the Civil War. Because if you think about it, 1916, I think we did the math, I can't do it in my head right now, 50-some years, right? His family actually was involved with it. And that's kind of how I felt. My grandfather was in World War II. There's not too many of those guys left. So, but my grandfather witnessed the horrors of World War II. He saw it. My dad's father, the first Dr. William Hutchings. Oh, so who's his dad? And so what does that tell you about Dr. Hutchings and Tilly? had been a doctor in the Union Army, my grandmother and grandfather Hutchings still lived in what Dad called the home place down in Grand Tower, the wide spot in the road. I couldn't remember visiting them before. My mother was very standoffish about my dad's side of the family, probably because she's from Missouri, and that was considered part of the southern part. That was the Confederate part. Okay? So all these things went through my mind when I read chapter 15. I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to go back. So, talks about the goggles. So on page 9, I want to point out, I would recommend before you give me the book back on Thursday that you go back and completely reread chapter 1. We don't really have time for that. But page 9, my mother and her brother are twins. This is now the doctor driving in the car, what he's saying to his son. You'll meet Noah. They all live together in the home place. My dad and mother and my aunt and uncle. I wonder who the aunt and uncle are. People lived however they could in years past, sharing out what they had. Seemed like most of my dad's patients paid him in fish out of the river and vegetables out of their garden. A doctor doesn't get rich in Grand Tower. So he's talking about Dr. Hutchings, okay, that we just read about. He was the one who was taking care of the boys in the tent. So you had 4 parents, I said. This is key. This is interesting. You had 4 parents, I said to his dad. In a manner of speaking, I did. Dad watched the boys. It wasn't a bad way to grow up. They taught me how to make do and how to keep my private business private. Pretty good lessons. Okay, so that's kind of where I wanted to just give you a little bit of background and bring you back to chapter 1 and let you see how the story has come full circle. So here we go to chapter 15. Okay, so notice we have our little time and the Mississippi River. So the river between us, between Missouri and Illinois, between the Union and the Confederacy. And think about where Delphine and Kalinda were from. Should be a whole lot of little light bulbs right now. Chapter 15. It was that summer of 1916 when my dad took me and my little brothers down home to see his folks. Folks is another word for parents. Time has a different shape in Grand Tower, Illinois. And so when we got there, Dad was young Bill, and we were young Bill's boys. So he was William, Dr. William Hutchings, and when he gets there, they call him Bill, which is a nickname for William. Except for our Will, we call him Will. Summer afternoons are longer in southern Illinois than anywhere else and hotter. The sun hangs eternally just off center in the blinding sky. Dad spent the afternoons mostly up in Great Aunt Delphine's room. He sat at her bedside by the window that looks out across the river to where the wedding party drowned long ago. As one afternoon folded into the next, I began to see this was another reason for our visit. His Aunt Delphine was dying. Would she become another Grand Tower haunt, like the ghost woman with the flying gray hair who darted across the road into the Mississippi, like that ghost who grieved the loss of a son, though he was still alive? My little brothers, Raymond and Earl, trailed Great Uncle Noah on all his afternoon chores. They'd never seen a one-armed man before, and this one could do what other people needed both hands for. He could peel an apple, kill a rat, beat a hook, all kinds of things deeply interesting to 5-year-old boys. They had no idea. They had no idea he was entertaining them. They thought he was just going about his business. The only one of us who napped was old Dr. Hutchings. He sat on his porch rocker, transparent with age, courteous even in drooping sleep. So when they say transparent with age, as people age, they lose pigment. That's why people get gray hair. And you might notice like their skin almost looks sort of see-through and very delicate and fragile. So that's what they're saying. that he's become transparent with age. He had the dignity I saw in my dad. His clean white hands were folded neatly in his lap. These were the hands that had amputated Noah's arm in the first year of the war after the Battle of Belmont. And if you have some time, and I know Jack out there, you're my history buff, look up the Battle of Belmont, okay? And how many more arms and legs, how many thousands through all the blood-sick years of war? I knew the story because Grandma Tilly told me. She was a talker when she got going and could bring it all back for you. She was a talker when she got going and could bring it all back for you. So what were all of those chapters in between? Say it out loud. Come on. Yeah. I saw for myself the amputated arms sinking in the churning river as they brought the wounded back to Cairo. I still see it. Neither age nor the weather showed Grandma Tilly. She was a whirlwind from early morning on, cooking and baking for extra mouths. She was up and down the stairs, fetching and carrying for Aunt Delphine, and not letting anyone else do it. Carrying her slops, too, because there was no plumbing in the house. Do you understand that? So they would have like these chamber pot type things, they were called, and there were no toilets. And it was basically a bowl. And you did what you had to do, and they were emptied. But since Delphine was so sick, Tilly was taking care of it for her. Everybody else could go use an outhouse or something, but she was too sick. But she found a corner of every afternoon to round me up and lead me to the crest of the Devil's Backbone, to a flat rock they called the Devil's Footstool, just among themselves. It had aeroplane views out over the river and Tower Rock. There we sat, both of us barefoot, while she brought back the old times for me. She handed over the past like a parcel, seizing these days to do it. She couldn't sit there idle, of course, meaning she didn't sit still. It wasn't in her nature to sit and do nothing. So she was always doing something. She didn't know how to be idle or lazy. She brought an old sewing basket with pearls and little shells on the lid. I don't know if that sounds familiar. And her mendings. She darned over a milk glass egg and spun out her yarns. So remember that they would repair the socks on the egg, so it had that shape. Milk glass is, I actually have some milk glass. Maybe I'll send you a picture. My grandmother had it. She was a child during the Depression, and milk glass was kind of like, it looks sort of ceramic, sort of like china. It's just white and shiny. I have a couple of vases that I can show you. At first, I didn't know how to listen to tales that old, but we began to edge across the years toward each other, Grandma Tilly and I. I began to see the yellow lamplight on their faces, just a flicker at first. I heard calliope music wavering over the water. Remember the boat? At every turn the story took, I remembered I was just about the age now they were then, except for Cass. She was younger. What happened to Cass? She's down there. Grandma Tilly pointed a bent finger to a long dip between Backbone and another outcropping called Oven Rock. It looked like overgrown wilderness. It was a graveyard, but they didn't keep it up. By then I knew how she worked to keep the sentiment out of her voice. Still, it was about to break through. So she doesn't want them to know that she's sensitive about it, like that she still has some feelings. She died young. She died the year after the war, 1866. She was 17. Dr. Hutchings called it diphtheria. She always spoke of him as Dr. Hutchings. She addressed him as Dr. Hutchings. He's her husband. If it hadn't been diphtheria, it would have been something else. I washed her poor bird body and dressed her in the sprigged dimity she'd worn the night to the showboat, so the fancy dress, remember? I put her in a coffin and wouldn't let nobody near her. I held her in my arms one last time, and then I let her go again. She gave up on life after Kalinda left us. I waited for more and then said, "Why did Kalinda leave?" Now remember, we learned that Kalinda and Delphine are sisters, but they're different sisters. So they have the same background, and it all has to do with genetics and genes. So Kalinda clearly had the darker complexion and looked more like a black person than Delphine did. So let's find out what happened. Well, she was too dark to stay, wasn't she? She couldn't pass. I always thought she was the color of honey at the bottom of the jar. I expect she thought people would put two and two together and it would give Delphine away. You know how there were always rumors about them. People always were talking about them. So Kalinda wanted Delphine to have a life, to not be persecuted, to not be punished, and to have something. And Kalinda felt if she stayed, that would put Delphine at risk. So let's see what she did. No, she had in her mind to go out to California. She said out there she'd be light enough to be Spanish, and she was good with money. Remember, she would make the pralines and sell them, and then they stashed the money away. She always had some put by for the journey. She was a true bird of passage, always ready to take flight. There's that metaphor again. Bird on the wing, ready to take flight. So she's ready to go at a moment's notice. Did you ever notice? I mean, birds rarely stay in the same place for very long. They don't sit and watch TV like we do. They don't stay in the same place. They migrate, they move around. And so that's what she's comparing Kalinda to. Grandma Tilly looked out across the river to the west. A hard journey in them days before there was a train to take you all the way to California. We knew she'd go, and I was scared Cass would go with her. I thought the trip might kill her, but of course staying behind is what finally done her in. Kalinda was what they call a conjure woman down yonder in New Orleans. She could tell your fortune, and there'd have been a market for that in more built-up areas. Cass had the gift too. It's what drawed them together, closer than sisters. But I suppose it was too late for Cass. I think she'd been wore out by her visions before Kalinda come among us. A hot breeze stirred the trees. We never heard tell of Kalinda again. I expect she prospered. She had all those talents, didn't she? But we never heard. They had a brother, too, remember, in Paris, France. But they were the free people of color. And after the war, they had to find new selves. I suppose it was just better to cut their ties than go it alone. Think how many more there must be like them, perched very quiet up on people's family trees. Safe now from being called ugly names. And if you remember Mrs. Hanrahan, some of those names that she called Delphine, they were terrible things that you would never say to one another, right? Awful, terrible names. There was no tolerance for anything. It was a really awful, terrible time in history. That was the last afternoon of our visit. It had taken Grandma Tilly the week to tell her story. So the book is Grandma Tilly telling him about how she met Dr. Hutchings and how Delphine and Noah became husband and wife. But there's more. She bit off a thread. She didn't have all her teeth, not nearly all. Then she stole another look at where the graveyard had been, down where Cass was. "And your pa?" I said. "He's down there?" "Yeah, he's down there. We didn't bury Cass next to him. There wasn't any point to that. And of course, Mama's not there." Grandma Tilly turned away from me. "Mama went in the river." It was time to leave then, and somehow I wasn't ready. We climbed up off our rock, the Devil's Footstool, for the last time. Grandma Tilly had to look way up at me. I was getting to be what she called a big, tall galoot. We started down the backbone to the house. They never did get married, you know, she said, almost offhand. You're old enough to hear it. Who didn't? Ah, here's the catch, and think back to what Delphine said. Ready? Delphine and Noah. They never got married, but... Oh, we put it around that they were married. They said they went up to Centralia or somewhere to tie the knot. I forget now where we said they went, but they never did. It liked to break Noah's heart, but Delphine wouldn't have it. She said her kind didn't marry white men, and she was passing for white. She said it would betray all her traditions. Said her mother, her maman, would turn over in her grave. Her mother died during the war when New Orleans was occupied by our troops. We got that word. But anyway, Delphine would never marry Noah, though they're more married than most. But you know how she is. If she makes up her mind to something or lapses into a French language, you just as well get out of her road or get out of her way. Don't even try. Don't even try to convince her of anything else. She'd make a mule look agreeable. Mules are known for being kind of stubborn. I remember one more thing Grandma Tilly told me. She said that time was like the Mississippi River. It only flows in one direction. She meant you could never go back. But of course we had. She'd taken me back. She was a good storyteller. We went on down to the house. She had a way of telling you so much you thought you'd heard it all, and I knew where she'd learned that. The night before we left Grand Tower, Great Uncle Noah wrung the neck off a fat fryer to my little brother's great excitement. It's a chicken. It would wring its neck. She loaded us down with deviled eggs, buttermilk biscuits. She piled us high with jars of her rhubarb preserves and looked around around herself to see what else ought to have. We filled our bottles from their well. Dad personally filled down the points on the spark plugs, and we made an early start the next day. The three old folks were on the porch to see us go. We'd said our goodbyes to Great Aunt Delphine the night before, up in her cluttered room under the portrait of her yellow-haired father. She couldn't speak, but those great fringed violet eyes ate us alive. She wanted to see them. And I wonder why it was so important for her to see them. The touch of her little pillowed hand lingered on mine long after. She didn't want to let go. We left in the cool of the morning. Being parked on the backbone helped because the Ford started better on a slant. I got the engine to catch after no more than 5 minutes. We'd settled the little boys, brown as berries now. They're dark. On the back seat. Then, in this miraculous morning, Dad climbed up into the heaving car on the passenger side. He was letting me drive. My heart sang. I was to drive and let out the brake and fiddle with the gas lever so that Dad could turn back and wave to them up on the porch. He waved until the house and then the hill and then the town were swallowed in our dust. We made good time going home, keeping the river on our left, retracing our route so they're heading north. Though we had more flats, Raymond and Earl wanted to stop the night and make our camp where we had before. They wanted this trip to have the exact shape. Dad pretty well convinced them that we'd found our original campground when it was time to pull off that evening, though we never found a trace of the old campfire. We built another one and ate better that night than weenies on sticks. Remember, because Grandma Tilly packed them all kinds of goodies. Fried chicken and biscuits and jam and all kinds of goodies. After the dust of the day, there were circles around our eyes where the goggles had been. So these are not like our cars, you guys. They're not. It's open and it's dusty, so they would wear goggles. The twins were nodding off against each other before the dying fire. I sat next to Dad on the running board. That's the step on the side of the car. As if he'd waited for this moment, he said, I've been thinking of getting into the war if the country does. It shook me. Then I saw this was another reason for the trip. You'll think I'm too old for a soldier, he said, and maybe I am, but they'll need doctors. I didn't want to spring it on you last minute. You'd have to take over at home till I got back. Be there for your mother and the boys. In the quiet, I heard my dad waiting. He wanted it to be all right with me. He wanted my approval. Nothing this grown-up had happened to me before. This was something Grandma Tilly couldn't understand. How war promises a boy it could make a man out of him. Well, your dad went to the war, didn't he? I said. Yes, he did. They can't fight a war without a doc. My father isn't Dr. Hutchings, Dad said. Noah's my father. Grabbed hold of the running board. The night revolved around me. And Delphine's my mother. She's slipping away, and I wanted this time with her. We couldn't be mother and son, you see. She didn't trust the world. How terrible. She didn't trust the town. She never knew when somebody would see her for who she was and turn on her. She wouldn't hand that on me. It could have closed too many doors in my face, so I was named for Dr. William Hutchings, his uncle. They had no other children, the doctor and your Grandma Tilly, none of their own, so I was their son too. As you said, I had 4 parents. Let that sink in. He didn't mention love. It wasn't a word they used, but there was plenty they didn't mention. I am proud of every drop of blood in me, Dad said. Quiet to keep from waking the boys. One day, when you've had time to think it over, I hope you'll be proud too. I remember Grandma Tilly speaking of the blood hurrying through her veins. Now I felt the blood hurry through mine, flowing like the Mississippi River, as my dad and I sat there on the running board under the sky crowded with stars. I didn't have to think it over. I was proud of anything that made me his son. I was proud of being Noah's grandson and Delphine's grandson. I was older now, too, a lot older than when this trip began. Older and looking ahead. One day I tell a son of my own the story of who we were. A son or a daughter with enormous violet eyes. And that's the end. So what did you think of that? You don't have to tell me, but you can if you want. A note on the story is really good. It gives you some background and history and tells you where the author drew the information from. So historical fiction, remember, always has a true element to it, but it's not necessarily a true story. So the events that happened, clearly the Civil War in 1861 and the Battle of Belmont, the town of Cairo was real. So a lot of what happened are things that might have happened, but the story itself wasn't true. So whenever authors write books like this, they usually do some research first. So if you get a chance before you turn this book back into me on Thursday, read a note on the story. I hope you enjoyed it, boys and girls. I did. I've enjoyed all the books we read together this year. It was really fun. We read Number the Stars, Thunder Rolling in the Mountains, Phantom Tollbooth, and this one. We didn't get to Mod 4, but that's okay. You did really great, and you worked really hard. I know we missed out on a few things, but that's all right. Keep working hard, guys. Keep reading. Read all summer, and keep your head in the game so that you're ready for 6th grade. I'm proud of you.